Welcome to your lesson on the vertebrate nervous system. Today we're going to try to cover the central nervous system and then talk about the peripheral nervous system as well. And we'll get through as much of this as we can. This unit is called homeostasis. So this is the first part of our homeostasis unit. And the idea of homeostasis is that you can regulate what's going on in the body. So you can maintain a certain level of a whole bunch of different things. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the actual homeostasis endocrine section. But the idea would basically be your body receives messages from all its sensory input somewhere, and then you have to process that information, make a decision, and then cause something to happen. So for example, if you touch a hot stove, there is temperature sensors in your fingers that send information through the nerves to your spinal cord. It actually doesn't have to get up to the brain for you to make a decision. Your spinal cord can actually make decisions. So that's what a reflex would be. So it'll go all the way up into your spinal cord. The spinal cord makes a decision and sends information back out other nerves to the muscles to tell them to pull the hand away. At the same time, you have it going up to the brain. So the information goes to the spinal cord, but the information to move your hand is already on its way back to your hand before it ever reaches your brain, so that you're actually protecting your hand and moving it away before it gets burnt. And so you'll actually move the hand and then say, ow. Like that's how pain kind of works. You're trying to get yourself out of that situation as quickly as possible. So that movement, getting yourself out of there, takes milliseconds. Whereas with the endocrine system, which is your hormone system, the glands and all the hormones that they produce and dump into the blood, you're going to have to dump that information into the blood, allow it to travel to the cells that are supposed to be affected. Then they have to read the information from the hormone, react to it, produce their own chemicals or whatever it is they're supposed to do. They're supposed to react, cause a change, and then as long as it takes to turn it on for the hormone system, you also then have to turn it off. So hormones are more like a slower to start but longer lasting effect. And the nervous system is very quick to start, quick to stop for that kind of a thing. Okay? You have about 100 billion nerve cells in your brain. And if you were to imagine the size of a grain of rice, that would be about the size of 1 million nerve cells. So they are very, very, very small. That being said, you do have some nerve cells that are ridiculously long in the body. And it will be one nerve cell can run up all the way up your leg. So you can have very, very long ones, but the vast majority of the ones, especially the ones that are up here in your brain, are little short suckers, very, very tiny and very well interconnected. And you'll see that when we get to the actual structure of them in the next part of the note. Right? So the two major parts of your vertebrate nervous system, and we're just talking vertebrates, so we're talking about anybody with a backbone, right? Any animal with a backbone has a similar setup. So you have your central nervous system, or the CNS for short. That's going to be including the brain and the spinal cord. Then you've got your peripheral nervous system. Peripheral means anything coming off of that. So that's any of the nerves coming off of the spinal cord that are going to connect to your body organs and the CNS together to allow your brain to be able to talk to the body and vice versa, the body be able to give the information to the brain. Within the peripheral nervous system, you have something called the motor division. The motor division uses something called a motor neuron, and you basically want to think about these as doing the job of actually getting something done. So you want to move a muscle, you use a motor neuron will send the information to tell the muscle to contract. You want to, make the hairs on your skin stand up so that you can get little goosebumps. Motor neuron will tell the skin to contract like that to pop up those may give you your goosebumps, right? So whatever it is, whether it's going to a cell that's going to release a hormone in a gland somewhere or whatever it is, your motor system gets the job done. We call that efferent, E. Think E as leaving and going away, because the message is coming from the central nervous system away from it through the PNS or the peripheral nervous system to the organs. So away from the CNS. Okay? That would be then broken down further into somatic, which are the type of muscle cells that you have voluntary control over. You can choose to move your arms or not. That's up to you. And you also have the autonomic, which is, think automatic, but don't use the word automatic. Autonomic, so it's self-driving. And this is your involuntary control. These are your reflexes. And they have special versions of motor neurons that you don't actually have any conscious control over. They will just happen. We're going to do a little reflex lab in the next couple days to take a look at that. Within the autonomic, so the one you don't control, your involuntary reflex control, you have something called the sympathetic nervous system, which is fondly referred to as the fight or flight. So that's your... it'll boost up some parts of your system and shut down others in order to get you ready to get heart and muscles ready for action. But when your brain and your heart and your muscles are ready for action, you don't really care about your reproductive organs. That's less important, so that gets less blood flow. You don't really care about your digestive organs. That's going to get less blood flow and less important information sent up to the brain. Okay. So you turn on things that are going to help you to fight or flight. You turn down other things. And the parasympathetic is the exact opposite. Parasympathetic relaxes you. And so it'll allow the muscles and the brain to calm down, and it will turn on other things like the digestive system in order to boost its importance. So they're opposite to one another, and they're working together in order to make sure that you've got your fight or flight or your rest and digest kind of a feeling to it. One of the interesting things about stress, and we'll talk more about stress in a different lesson, is that the sympathetic nervous system gets sparked and turned on when you are stressed out. It helps with the adrenaline rush. It helps you to feel like you are able to get up and go and do things. So if you are feeling stressed, next time you have a test or a quiz or something like that, and you get that, everybody has test anxiety to some degree because you're worried about your performance. If you eat when you're stressed, some people are just naturally stress eaters. Anybody in this room probably? You're a stress eater. What you're actually doing is you don't realize you're doing this, but you are turning on your parasympathetic by eating. Because by eating, you're stimulating that part of your nervous system. And because it's on or off, if you stimulate the parasympathetic, you shut down the sympathetic because it's on, off. So by eating, you're actually trying to literally reduce the nervous system stress that you've got going on. It's not always a good thing because some people don't know when to stop eating. But let's say you are on your way into an interview. You're going to go get a job. Chew some gum in the waiting room. Get rid of it before you get in there because it's very rude to be chewing gum when you're in front of your boss. But if you're chewing gum or take a bite of an apple or something like that, eat while you're in the waiting room. It will actually calm you down a little bit. I wouldn't say grab bags of chips because that may have other effects, but do something that will calm you. That's why a lot of people will, when they're nervous, they'll chew on their pen and stuff like that. You're stimulating the parasympathetic. So it's interesting, right? Just to be able to turn on and off your different stress things. Along with the motor division, which causes action to happen, you also have the sensory division. And the sensory division's job is going to be to make sure that you're receiving all the right information that you've got. And again, this is all coming from the peripheral nervous system, information going towards the CNS now. Not information coming from the central nervous system to tell you what to do, but you're giving information so that the central nervous system can decide what to do. And so in this case here, you've got your sensory neurons, and we would call them A, afferent. So A is to, E, efferent is away from. And it's always to and away from the central nervous system. That's our main goal. Right? So from the organs to the peripheral from the organs through the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. And I got this diagram here off of a guy who's got a great YouTube video that I want to show you shortly. So again, we see the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system, where you have your brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is everything coming off of the spinal cord or going towards the spinal cord. If it's sensory or afferent, it's information from sensors somewhere, or even just regular cells sending information to the spinal cord. And if it's the motor division, it's from the spinal cord to something to make it act. Right? Then again, within the motor division, you've got the voluntary control, and you have the involuntary control, the autonomic nervous system. And then within the autonomic, you have the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Fight or flight, rest and digest. In between your spinal cord, you may have these short little myelinated You'll learn more about myelin when we actually talk about the nerve cell. But these little short guys with these little wrappings around them, these are very, very fast neurons. Whereas these ones that are not myelinated, there's no little, looks like jelly beans or something around them. There's no little things around them. These are much slower fibers. So you can have fast fibers and you can have slow nerves. Right? It just depends on how quickly you need to get information to where you need to go. The vast majority of the nerves in the brain are slow. Same with the spinal cord. They are slow fibers. And the vast majority of the ones that are going off to the body are these fast fibers that have this myelin sheath on it in general. Okay. So again, the central nervous system has the spinal cord, and that's going to take information in both directions because it's the main highway up to the brain. Right? Inside the skull, there is a little hole at the bottom, the underside of the skull. The foramen magnum is going to be where it's going to come out of the brain, and that's where it goes right down and inside the spinal cord. The spinal cord will come through, it's going to come inside your backbones, your vertebrae, so that your vertebrae are also going to be protecting the nerves themselves. So here on the right-hand side, you can see there's the two of the vertebral bones anyway, with a little cushioning in between, little disc. And you've got the spinal cord running in there. And then you can see there's these big nerves that come out of the spinal cord in the open gaps. And that's the peripheral nervous system that's going to go off to the different parts of the body, either sending or receiving information. If it is the type of neuron that sends information to the brain and spinal cord, then it actually comes in the back. I want you to think of this picture that you're seeing here as you're looking at the front side of a person, and you have taken you're looking at a cross-section of that spine, but you're looking at the person. So this dorsal means back, ventral is belly. So this is the back side of the spinal cord. And then this is the front side or the belly side of the spinal cord. Okay. So you have sensory information come in the back. You can have a decision being made either by the spinal cord or shuttle it up to the brain and let the brain make the decision. And then you have the action will come out of the other end and go back out to whatever gland or muscle or whatever it is that you need to have the action happen with. Okay. So in and out have slightly different routes. There are also two different types of nerve tissue. The white matter is called white matter because it looks white. And on this picture, it doesn't look so white. It looks more yellowish. But white matter is myelinated. And again, we'll talk about that afterwards. But it's covered with this protein and this little sheath that it's got on there. The myelin sheath is actually able to speed up nerve transmission. And then you've got gray matter, which is not myelinated. And that's what the main part of the spinal cord that goes up to the brain. And the brain itself is mostly not myelinated. So these are fast fibers if they're white, slow fibers if they're gray. So let me get to our brain. The brain has, even though when you're actually looking at it, it's just like a pink lump of squishy stuff. I don't know if in grade 11, if you had a chance to do the Piggy Lab, and if you did do the Piggy Lab, if you had a chance to get through it so quickly that you actually were able to take out the brain, it's very squishy. It's actually almost uncomfortably squishy when you squish it. It's squishy. But if you get a healthy brain, it's got proper blood flow to it and everything. When the person first dies and you take it out, it's like this pinky kind of a color. Lots of blood vessels and whatnot. But the actual brain itself is into two hemispheres. You have a right and a left lobe. And this is just looking at the left lobe. And then within each of those lobes of the brain, two halves of the brain, hemispheres, you've got certain sections that are associated with certain feelings or thoughts or ability to control the body, where you receive the sensory information and where you send information out to do stuff. So if you're talking about this front section, the frontal lobe, this lobe is still developing in all of you. So you probably won't have your mature adult brain until you reach about 25 years old. This is the part of the brain where you are making your decisions, where you're just determining your personality and your character and who you are. Your upper level of thoughts happen in this particular area. And that's why 1 minute teenagers can be extremely reliable, and you all know this because you're all going through this right now, and the very next minute, completely unreliable. you're happy and excited one minute, and then the next minute, those horrible hormones are doing stuff as you're developing, and next thing you know, you're sad and you don't even know why. There's lots of things going on, or something will happen, somebody will say something to you, and if you're in one situation, you're just kind of brush it off. But if you're in another situation, it's devastating and you just can't pick yourself up and you just feel sad and upset and angry. And it just depends on exactly what moment in time you're in. Sometimes you're better able to handle stress than others, right? And adults will have that as well. The major difference is that your frontal lobe is not finished developing. So you're still going through not just emotional times, but you're also going with hormones and whatnot flushing through your body, developing you. But you also don't necessarily have the same type of reasoning. We go through personality changes in your teenage years, and it's because of this major development at that front part of your brain. Other parts of your brain, and if you were to look at one, you would see that there's this actual divide line right here in the middle. You've got the primary motor cortex. So the cortex, I'm going to learn about this when we talk about the kidney as well. Anytime you see the word cortex, I want you just to think the outside of something. And then if you see medulla, it's the inside of something. Remember we said with the thylakoid that word lumen just meant really the inside, like the hollow inside of it. And so that's the same thing here. Cortex would be the outside section, and then medulla would be the more towards the inside, right? So you got the primary motor cortex dealing with your actual movement and motion, and you've got somatosensory, which think soma means body. So this is where you're getting lots of information coming in about your senses here. But within the senses, if you're looking at what parts of the brain are doing what, you have on the side here, you have the temporal lobe, which they found activates and is lighted up when you're not just hearing something and not just seeing something, but when you're trying to make sense of what you hear and what you see. Because the actual what you hear could be in a slightly different area. The occipital lobe, for example, takes in your vision information. So your optic nerve from the back of your eyeball goes all the way to the back of your brain there. This is also why if people get hit in the back of the head, they see stars. This is that whole reason, is because they're getting whacked in the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe sort of takes in the visual information and starts to process it, but the temporal lobe helps you to understand what you're seeing. Have you ever been in the room before or ever seen something where it's kind of like you can't quite make it out in the corner and it kind of looks like, I don't know, sometimes it looks like a scary dude, and then you realize later on, oh, it's just something hanging on a thing, and it's just and then you can't go back to seeing it as being scary because you now know what it is. When you're first getting that weird visual information, the occipital lobe is saying, oh, what is that? It looks similar to this, or it could be this, or it could be this, something scary or something not. And then when your temporal lobe gets the information, they say, oh, that's just a shirt hanging on a hanger. It's nothing. And so now you can go, and then your frontal lobe can then be like, oh, okay, we're safe, we're good. And there's other parts in more to the inside, your amygdala and a few other places that are going to be involved with helping you process your emotions. They're more towards the inside of the bottom there. Okay, so different parts of the big lobe are going to be helping you with your analyzing your senses and all that kind of stuff. Your frontal lobe is going to help you with stopping you from being too crazy. Like, for example, you guys are more likely to take your bicycle and go off a jump than an adult would be. Because by the time, it's not just about coordination. It's that sense of you don't, as a child, more so younger than your age right now, but as a child, you have less of a sense of danger and what death means and what pain means because you just haven't been through enough of it. Whereas an adult, because you have that frontal lobe that's been through all these experiences of, oh yeah, last time when I broke my arm after I did that, like you have more inhibitions that slow you and actually are saving your life as you're getting older. Okay. So that's what the frontal lobe is going to help you with. It's going to help you with decision making. The other major parts of the brain that you see here are the cerebellum. Cerebellum is going to help you with balance and things like that. It's more like just this automatic trying to keep your body upright, give you a sense of direction and things like that. The medulla oblongata is going to be associated with, again, automatic things that you're not controlling, like your breathing rate, your heart rate, things like that. Very basic kind of brainstem kind of stuff. And the pons is basically just the communication relay between those different sections. Okay. There's going to be a picture like this on the test where you're just going to have to label. It'll be like a matching question where you're going to just have to match up what goes where. So you do want to spend a little bit of time staring at this one later before you write your test. In addition to these lumpy bits here, we've mentioned before that when you see all these kind of folds, what you're trying to do is get a very large organ into a very small space, and that's exactly what we're seeing again here. We're seeing a very large organ squished into a small space, so that we got all these different folds and whatnot that are going on with the brain. Around the brain, you have 3 protective layers. They're called meninges. If you've ever heard of meningitis, the itis tells you that the meninges are inflamed. If you have meningitis, it can be very dangerous because when the meninges get swollen, what's going to end up happening is they put pressure on the brain and on the spinal cord. And you'll get the 3 levels of the meninges. Actually, it's on another picture that I've got here. But the 3 levels of the meninges are all sort of there kind of cushioning the brain and doing these different things, also creating a blood-brain barrier to try to make sure that certain chemicals that are floating around the body that would otherwise cause harm to the brain are not allowed access. So if you have a specific drug that you need to take for a certain condition, and if you don't want it to affect the brain, then you have to make sure that it won't cross the blood-brain barrier. And then if you do want it to affect the brain, then you have to make sure it can. In other words, there's more discovery that has to happen with drugs than just saying, oh, we'll just throw a drug into the body and see what happens. How do you want to affect? What organs do you want it to talk to? Et cetera, et cetera. Within the meninges, you also have this cerebrospinal fluid. And that spinal fluid is going to help to absorb shock. It's going to help to bring food towards these cells to help feed them, and also to remove junk from the brain cells as well. And this is where, if you've ever heard of a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap, it's like a huge big horse needle they shove into your spinal cord, and they suck out just a little bit of juice. They have to be very careful that they don't damage you when they do this, but they can suck out just a little bit of fluid, and they can go and test that and see if there's any kind of like an infection in that particular area. They can test for meningitis this way, etc. This is also, if you go the reverse direction, rather than puncturing and pulling, this is also where a woman can get an epidural when she's going to give birth. You would inject a little bit of fluid that would numb her into the spinal cord in this particular area between the meninges there. Actually, it's just outside the one meninge where there's a gap. It's called the epidura. And you're going to put an epidural, the juice, the drug, into that section to numb the spine so that from that point down, she's not feeling the contractions the same way that she would. She doesn't feel the pain the same way she would. Okay. Moving on. Major sections of the brain. Again, you got that forebrain. That's the part in the front. The cerebrum is the biggest part that we were looking at in that other picture. That's the part that had the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital, all that kind of stuff. And again, it's split into 2 hemispheres, 2 halves. This used to be more prevalent back in like the 90s when they really thought that this was a thing. But they sort of see the right side of your brain seems to light up a little bit more, or is associated at least with seeing things and being able to be creative and have spatial awareness. It's not 100% true both sides of your brain, when you're looking at something, both sides of your brain are reacting to it. But people still think that if you're right-brained, you're very creative. If you're left-brained, maybe you're more logical. But it's not. As more and more data comes in, it's being less and less pushed as an idea in your psychology classes in university, behavioral psychology or whatever. But it used to be like a fundamental, yeah, I'm right-brained, I'm left-brained, and no, it's not really that kind of a thing. Not quite as much. But what is interesting, though, is that you do have certain parts of your brain that will control certain parts of your body. So, for example, your right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and vice versa. The left side of your brain will control the right side of your body. So that if you have something wrong in your right brain, you'll see the paralysis in the left side of the body, and vice versa. What's also very interesting, though, is that the body can, if there's a bit damaged part of the brain, other parts of the brain can take over. So, for example, there's this little girl who had, I forget exactly what was wrong with her. I don't know if it was tumor or if it was epileptic seizures or what, I forget. This little girl had half of her brain removed. She had a hemispherectomy. Half of her brain gone. That lobe is gone. And obviously for the first while, left side, let's just say the left side remained, then she still has the right side of her body control. but no left side. But over time, she was able to train the remaining part of her brain to be able to control the whole body. So even if initially a part of the brain can't do something, it can be taught to do it and to kind of fill in the blanks and help you out, right? So interesting stuff in brain surgery, etc. So frontal lobe, again, this is where you're controlling your voluntary muscles. If you want to say something, if you want to do something, you're making a choice to do that. You can control that with the frontal lobe. It's also where they think your personality is. And we know that, or at least we strongly suspect that, and we're pretty confident about it, because when people have damage to the frontal lobe, they are a completely different person. Look up Phineas Gage sometime, and look what happened to him. He had like a whole iron pole go right through his head. Completely different guy afterwards. What they used to do as well, thankfully they don't do this anymore, it's a bit barbaric, but if someone was extremely aggressive, like a scary dude who's been hurting people, when they put them into the mental asylum, they would give them shock therapy, or even sometimes they would actually remove the frontal lobe. They would take out a chunk of the front, and that made them passive, but it killed their personality, like just down. So yeah, they weren't scary dudes anymore, but they just literally lost who they were and became completely different people because of that information, that personality just gone. So interesting what they used to do. I'm glad they don't do that anymore. Again, temporal lobe is vision and hearing, but it's trying to make sense of what you're hearing and seeing. The parietal lobe is more about touch and temperature, so those senses. And a little bit about, can you understand what it is that you've just heard in terms of speech? Speech is this whole other beast, different than sounds. The occipital lobe, always think you're looking at eyeballs. What are you actually seeing? And then trying to interpret it along with the help of the temporal lobe, trying to figure out what is it that I'm seeing. Okay, and here's some more pictures for you. Also within the actual, the primary somatosensory cortex, this little section here, and the motor cortex up here, there seems to be very specific areas that are associated with different parts of the body. So it's not just whole body goes to the entire thing. It's got a sensation in your leg. Okay, it's going to go here and be processed. Sensation in your face, it'll go down here and be processed. Interesting that it does that. This section here, Broca's section, you'll hear about this if you take any kind of psychology courses, behavioral psychology stuff in university. The Broca's area, they found that when that's damaged, people can't speak properly. So this is also in that video I showed you where they were using that wand and they were coming down over the guy's face, and all of a sudden he wasn't processing his sound anymore. It was like, rather than saying the numbers out loud, kind of went funny. That's because they were stimulating the Broca's area, and he couldn't quite get the words out anymore. Right? Have an idea in general of what each of these parts do. Any one that's important has been listed in text. So there will be other matching questions where you're given the terms frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital, and you have to match them to what they're most associated with. It's meant to be easy answers. It's kind of like the brain one, and you're going to use the same kind of terms to know what they do, not just where you can find them. There are a whole bunch of terms on here as well, though, that I really don't need you to know. It's just more if you're interested. Like, if you never say the word central sulcus, I will be quite fine with that. That's totally fine. Just the ones, again, that are listed in text are the ones that are really important. Okay, cerebral cortex. You have the cerebrum, which is the giant structure, but the cortex is just the outside layers, this fold, the folded section. And the cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter, so it's slower nerve fibers. Super important. Again, this is helping you have your higher thinking is in the cerebral cortex. The corpus callosum is only found in placental mammals. So you'd have to be born attached to your mother's inside. So not even marsupial mammals, which would be like a kangaroo or something like that. This is just placental mammals. And what it does is it actually will join and be a source of information between the two hemispheres of the brain, between the two halves of the cerebrum. Okay? And that cerebrum talking back and forth can sometimes be cut, like in the case of I had a friend in high school, she had really bad grand mal seizures, epileptic seizures, and they cut her corpus callosum. So that bridge, because what would happen is she'd have a firestorm of electrical activity in the one side of her brain, and it would spread across the entire brain. But when you cut the corpus callosum, the firestorm doesn't go across. And so it pretty much, I'm not 100% sure exactly whether she ever had an epileptic seizure ever again. I'm sure she was still on drugs as well, but it certainly helped. It wasn't as frequent, and it wasn't as grand mal kind of stuff that was going on. So changed her life to have that little surgery. Thalamus is basically going to take some information in and send it up to the higher thinking cerebrum. But the one that we are going to care about for our course is the hypothalamus. Hypo just means below. We've seen that word before. So where the thalamus is in this picture here, you have the hypothalamus just below it. And the hypothalamus is going to talk to this little gland here called the pituitary. The pituitary is not brain tissue. It's a gland. It produces hormones. And so between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, you're allowing the brain to connect to the endocrine system. Nervous system, endocrine system talking to each other at this point. Okay. The olfactory lobe that you can see somewhere, it's not in there, not in this picture. The olfactory lobe then is all about smell, being able to process your smell information. One of the strongest memories you can make is by having a certain scent. You can smell that scent and it'll trigger memories better than anything else that you've got associated with your brain. Okay. Again, I don't need you to know every single thing that's on this picture. If you remember where the hypothalamus and the pituitary is, that's good. What I'm doing here is trying to give you a cross section, so you're just looking at the one hemisphere from the inside, because the other picture gave it to you from the outside. Right? So you've got also this corpus callosum. That's the part that's joining the two hemispheres together. Hypothalamus, of course, thalamus, what else? So there's the cerebellum cut open. Again, this is about balance and other sort of coordinated movement. Pons is trying to join the cerebrum to the medulla and the spinal cord. It's the relay station. And I think that's it for this picture that matters. Okay. And if you're ever talking about the brainstem, you're talking about this section here where the bottom of the brain begins to join the spinal cord. Okay, so brainstem again, less developed. You've got lots of gray matter, so you got the shorter, slow fibers, and you're basically just trying to coordinate between what's going on with the spinal cord and what's going on with your upper level brain. Hindbrain again, cerebellum controls your limbs, muscle tone, balance, all that kind of stuff. And notice it says here it uses excitatory and inhibitory impulses. In other words, it can tell another nerve you need to fire, or it can tell a nerve stop firing. And that's really important when you're trying to balance muscles. So for example, if you just raise your left arm, okay, the amount of muscle coordination that needed to go in to do that is incredible. It's not just about your deltoid shoulder muscle pulling things up. You have to stabilize the entire body. So you've got to have all of your side muscles and the muscles on the other side of your body as well are all stabilizing to make sure that when you lifted your hand, you didn't knock yourself over with that motion, right? Everything has to become stabilized. This is why when you put your back out, I don't know if you've done that yet, but when you put your back out, you suddenly realize that every little tiny movement, oh man, I've been using my back the entire time to try to stabilize your body. You bend over to pick something up, right? You have to use so many different things, and it's the cerebellum that coordinates that movement that's going to tell one muscle you need to contract while telling other muscles you need to relax, stop contracting, or stay stiff in the kind of that halfway in between world where you're going to contract so much and then stop. Okay? That's the cerebellum, all about limb control, balance, muscle tone. Again, pons is just the relay station. The medulla oblongata, this is your brainstem just before you hit the spinal cord. This is going to be your involuntary muscle stuff, so controlling your breathing movements, how fast your heart is beating, even things like blood vessel diameter. So if you want more blood to go to a certain area, you expand the vessel. If you want less blood to go to an area, you constrict the vessel. And around every single one of these major arteries and whatnot, even the veins, you have smooth muscle tissue. So you're able to squeeze the tube, or you're able to relax the tube and dilate it. And that's all coordinated through what we call the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. That's going to be all your reflexes and kind of stuff that you just don't have any conscious control over. Okay? Random fact, if you want better control over something, you're just going to have more nerves going to that particular area. So you've got kind of like some control over your arm, but you have fine control over your fingers. And you'll probably find that if your dominant hand is really dominant compared to the other one, you'll find that your other hand is quite clumsy. You can grow those tracks. You can train your other hand to do what it needs to do. But right now you've got a lot of nerve control going up to the brain with conscious control of fingers on your dominant hand more so than on your non-dominant hand. So if you want to be able to control something, you're just going to have more nerves going to that particular area. Same thing with your senses. If you were to take just two fingers, take your nails of the two fingers, put them about 1 millimeter apart, and you were to touch along your hand as you go up, you're going to see that at some points you can feel the two separate nails, and at other points you can't. It just feels like one, and that's simply because of how many nerves are sitting there, how many sensory tools you have for pressure in that particular area. So you have high resolution in fingertips, that's why you feel things nicely, but as you go up the arm, not so much because it's just not necessary. Okay? Central versus peripheral. I'm going to show you this guy's video shortly. The meninges. The meninges are the 3 layers that are wrapping around the brain and the spinal cord. This is, they're named after, well, they're all called mater. Mater in Latin is mother. So the one that is right attached to the spinal cord or the brain is pia mater. It's basically like tender mother. She's protecting and covering the layers there. Then you get the arachnoid layer. Do you know what arachno is? Heard of arachnophobia before? What are you scared of if you have arachnophobia? Spiders, because arachna is spiders. And the reason it's called the arachnoid matter is because it looks kind of like spiderwebbish. That's it. So it's called the arachnoid layer. Then you have the dura mater, which is my favorite name because this means tough mother. So it's a much tougher layer. Up in the brain, the dura mater is actually attached to the skull, to the actual brain casing. But down in the spinal cord, it's not. But it's this tough layer outside. Then you get the arachnoid spongy layer. And then you get the pia mater, which is gently, very thin, easy to damage layer of the meninges. And then within that, you've got spaces and you've got fluid, spinal fluid, all that kind of stuff, kind of bathing the meninges and bathing the nerve cells that are there. Okay, so tender mother, arachnoid, and tough mother. I just like that name. Okay, within your spine, if you've ever heard of somebody's C-spine or T-spine, your C-spine is basically your neck down to, there's like a lumpy bit back there. Your C-spine is these ones up at the top. And then from there down to about halfway, you've got your thoracic spine. And then lower than that, all the way down to your, what's it called? Tailbone. So from lower back down to the tailbone, you've got your lumbar spine. And that's why they say if you buy a special car or you've got special chair, you have lumbar support because you're supporting that curved part of your back down at the bottom just to make yourself more comfortable. Right? Out of every single one of these vertebra, you have these big chunks of nerves coming out, and then they get finer and they go out to the different places that they have to go. And I want to show you this picture here. I don't have to memorize anything about these pictures. I just wanted to give you the visual. So you can see you've got each of the vertebrae. Okay, so cervical, the last one is the lumpy bit that you feel when you go down your neck and you suddenly hit a big lump. That's your 7th cervical, and then your thoracic starts after that. But coming out in between, you've got your spinal cord going right down and in between all of the vertebra bones. They have a hole in them. And then you have these tracks coming out. And depending on which vertebra you're at, whether you're like between the 4th and the 5th thoracic, whatever it is, different nerve tracks come out. So if you were to damage somewhere down in your, let's say you had, you damaged the vertebra down in your lumbar section, or whether you've actually damaged and cut the spinal cord or whether you're just pinching a nerve or something, you can tell what's being damaged because the information going to those particular organs is going to be affected. The higher up you have a break, let's say you actually broke your back, maybe you severed your spinal cord, the higher up that break happens, the more damage there is to the body because if the information coming from the brain can only, let's say, get to the 3rd cervical bone and coming out those nerves, there's no communication between the brain and anything below where that spinal cord was damaged. But the spinal cord can still make decisions on its own. So somebody with a massive spinal injury down below might still respond to reflexes. So, reflexes. You'll see that in your lab tomorrow. They could still respond to reflexes, but they wouldn't necessarily have conscious control over that arm or that leg or whatever, depending on where it is that they've been damaged. So you can have somebody who is quadriplegic, all 4 legs and arms paralyzed, all 4 limbs paralyzed, or paraplegic, where it's the legs, because that would be a lower down situation where they have the damage happening. And it all depends on what part of the spine did you actually damage. Some of the newer stuff that they're doing is actually pretty cool. When you have those nerve cells and you actually begin to damage them, one of the reasons why it damages so quickly is that you build scar tissue so fast in the human body that you separate the nerves by throwing in the scar tissue that shouldn't be there. And so it's not electrically conductive, so the nerves can no longer talk to one another. But if you can either slow the scarring or prevent the scarring from happening altogether, it may buy the body enough time for those nerves to begin to talk to one another again. And so you can actually, in some cases, depending on what the injury is, you can actually cure a spinal injury. But you have to be in the right place at the right time with the right technology to make sure that that scar tissue doesn't develop and cause that block between the parts of the spine speaking to one another. But I'll throw it online because I'm pretty sure there's a YouTube video of it. I'll throw it online. It's interesting and worth watching. It's how to build a beating heart video. If I can find it, I'll throw it on there for you guys. Very, very cool. We normally would have watched it if we had more time in our course because it's all about biotech stuff. Okay, so that's just an idea of just showing you, okay, depending on where it's coming out, you'll have different control over different parts of the body. This is also where the chiropractic world kind of comes into this conversation. You can have, in some cases, a pinched nerve or muscles are pulling the bones out of joint, causing pain in other areas. And by realigning the spine and no longer pinching those nerves, you can cause lots of good things to happen, not just in your back where you feel like there's a rib out, but in other parts of the body as well. There can be some health benefits from that. There is definitely some good scientific basis for having your spine being straight and having good posture. It can definitely help you with a lot of things. It can even help you with your mood. Being hunched over all the time, it has different effect on your hormones than standing up straight. It's just weird, the types of things that just even body position can have the effects on your endocrine system and on your nervous system. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to show you this Anand guy's video where I got these pictures off of, because I want you to have a better idea of what the autonomic nervous system is talking about.
The autonomic nervous system can be divided into the sympathetic nervous system, also known as the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, also known as the rest and digest response. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary control of body tissues. It arises from the central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord basically. So here I am drawing the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord can be divided into segments. The spinal cord is divided into 31 segments. We have 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal segments. These are important because the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves arise from these spinal cord segments. Remember that the autonomic nervous system is involuntary and that we have no control over it. Now let us look at the purpose and function of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and how they differ from each other. So the sympathetic nervous system, for example, prepares for activity. It provides more glucose so you can have energy. It increases the heart rate, dilates the pupils, and prevents the activity of digestion. The parasympathetic is the rest and digest response, on the other hand, and its main goal is to conserve body energy. So these include increasing gut mobility, stimulate digestive secretions, and slow down heart rate, amongst many other things. Now let us mainly focus on the sympathetic nervous system, so the fight or flight response. Now let us look at what organs the sympathetic nerves mainly target. Just overview and what they do. But first I must introduce the ganglions here. The ganglion is where nerve cells synapse with one another. So usually in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, especially in the sympathetic nervous system, there are cells coming out of the spinal cord, and then they synapse in the ganglion, and then this new cell will then target the tissue. So there are many sympathetic ganglions, but here I am only drawing the sympathetic chain, the celiac, and the inferior mesenteric ganglions, which supply the abdominal area of our body. Another very important thing to understand about the sympathetic nervous system is the nerves arising from the spinal cord. They arise from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Anyways, so here we can see some preganglionic neurons coming from the spinal cord, and then they will synapse in the ganglion here. And then this new neuron is called the postganglionic neuron, which will then carry the sympathetic information to a target tissue. Again, we won't go into too much detail into the nerves and where they come from, essentially. Just know that the sympathetic nerves originate either from the thoracic or lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So sympathetic activity will target the pupils, for example, causing the pupils to dilate for greater vision. It will also target the salivary glands, inhibiting salivation. Sympathetic activity will relax your airways and increase the heart rate. And this is normal during activity.
I have to stop and tell you guys about Lecturio. LECT.
Preganglionic neurons that will target the abdominal cavity will synapse in the celiac ganglion, and these postganglionic neurons will then target the digestive organs to inhibit digestion. It will target the liver to stimulate glucose production. And then neurons arising from the lumbar segment of the spinal cord will target the adrenal glands and will stimulate adrenaline and noradrenaline production. And this will, promote sympathetic activity. Then we have postganglionic neurons from the inferior mesenteric ganglion that will target the bladder, causing it to relax, so inhibiting micturition, as well as targeting the genitals to stimulate orgasm. Okay, so that was for the sympathetic activity. And the purpose of the sympathetic activity is to prepare the person for exercise. Basically, such as running or playing some sports or running away from a lion. Looking at the parasympathetic now, it's all to do with resting and digesting. So this is essentially, this parasympathetic activity essentially is what occurs after we eat and we're just resting, lying down. For the parasympathetic nervous system, we have to introduce the brainstem because the parasympathetic nerves, a lot of parasympathetic nerves arise from the brainstem, as well as the sacral region of the spinal cord. So cranial nerve 3 causes pupils to constrict. This is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, stimulates salivation by targeting the salivary glands. Similarly, cranial nerve 9 also targets salivary glands to stimulate salivation. A very, very important nerve, which is probably the main parasympathetic nerve, is the cranial nerve number 10, which is also known as the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve literally targets most of the organs and tissues for parasympathetic activity. So it causes constriction of the airways, slowing the heart rate down. It stimulates digestion and dilates intestinal blood flow. So we should have said this, but the parasympathetic neurons, they arise from either the brainstem or the sacral region of the spinal cord. So this nerves arising from the sacral region will target the rectum, causing it to relax. And also there are nerves that will target the bladder, causing bladders to constrict, so initiating micturition, peeing. As well as we have nerves that will target the genitals from the sacral segment. When the parasympathetic activity targets the genitals, it will actually stimulate arousal. So for example, the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for maintaining an erection, whereas the sympathetic will cause ejaculation, so orgasm. So that was for the parasympathetic nervous system, whose main function is for rest and digest. Now let us look into the synapses and neurotransmitters involved in sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. So let's take a section of the spinal cord and see how information from the central nervous system, so from the brain and the spinal cord, travels to the tissues via the parasympathetic or sympathetic nerves. Let us first look at the parasympathetic neurons and neurotransmitters. Information from the central nervous system comes down, and it will transfer this information to a preganglionic neuron, which in the parasympathetic nervous system's case is a lightly myelinated neuron, which is quite long. The preganglionic neuron will release neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, which will transfer this essentially propagation of information to the postganglionic neuron, which is often unmyelinated and quite short. And then this unmyelinated postganglionic neuron, which is quite short, will release a neurotransmitter acetylcholine again, which will target a tissue, causing a parasympathetic response. Now, in this case, it's targeting the heart, so it will release acetylcholine to slow down the heart rate. But this image is not quite correct because there's no ganglion when the parasympathetic nervous system targets the heart. But I hope you just understand the concept and the difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic. Anyway, so now let's look at the sympathetic. Now in the sympathetic, we also have a ganglion. Information from the central nervous system will essentially send information to the preganglionic sympathetic neuron, which in this case is lightly myelinated and quite short. It will synapse in the ganglion, release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, so you can see some similarities now between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. There's acetylcholine. And now this new postganglionic sympathetic neuron is actually going to be unmyelinated and long. And this this postganglionic neuron will release noradrenaline, the neurotransmitter noradrenaline, to target the heart and to increase the heart rate. So if you look at this diagram, you can see some differences in preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. You know, one is short, one is long, and it's opposite for both nervous systems. Anyways, when dealing with the sympathetic nervous system, it's important to introduce another tissue. So if here the information is in the preganglionic neuron, it's carrying the sympathetic information, it's short, it's lightly myelinated. This neuron can target the adrenal glands, releasing acetylcholine, which will target the adrenal glands, specifically the adrenal medulla. It will stimulate the adrenal medulla to produce noradrenaline again. So noradrenaline can be stimulated from the adrenal glands by the sympathetic nervous system, or it can be also produced by by the postganglionic sympathetic nerves. And both these noradrenaline, regardless of where they come from, when they target the heart, they will increase the heart rate. And this is what you want when you're exercising, increasing heart rate. So I hope that made sense. I hope you enjoyed this video.